Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining this session on moonlighting. Moonlighting, as you've already heard, generated a lot of buzz after the recent developments triggered by Wipro chief Rishabh Premji's tweet saying moonlighting was unethical, and pronouncements by the other IT majors, TCS and Infosys, all weighed in saying that employees, a bond kind of employees who indulge in moonlighting. So it's become quite a subject of debate over the last fortnight, and kind of got further escalated last week when one heard about Wipro firing 300 employees who were engaging in moonlighting. Right. So the whole subject of moonlighting or doing a second job while holding down a full-time job, has had the software industry fairly divided, and has quickly kind of spread to other industries and business. And today the debate has really occupied prime time across various sectors. We have an interesting panel discussing this issue. And the idea of this whole debate or this whole discussion is not so much to go back and revisit the controversy and, in a sense, beat down a subject that's sort of got beaten down, but actually look beyond what will emerge, what next for the whole gig economy and for the future of work, specifically in the context of lighting. And specifically, we want to address the issues of younger people who have, as it happens, a very different point of view from, let's say, relatively older folk. I mean, there is a unstated kind of age divide on this whole debate. So the idea is to really look at solutions and look at a way forward in how we go. We have an interesting panel discussing this issue, and I'd love to introduce them to all of you. First off, T.N. Hari. T.N. Hari is the co-founder of the Artha School of Entrepreneurship. He's an evangelist, thought leader, and influencer in the startup ecosystem. He's an alum of IIT Madras and IIM Calcutta. Hari has authored 8 books and is a regular columnist at Mint. His books, Saying No to Jugaad and From Pony to Unicorn and Diversity Beyond Tokenism, have been bestsellers. He's been part of the leadership teams at 5 high-growth startups, including Big Basket, and helped share their growth journeys and exits, including a listing at NASDAQ. 3 of these startups went on to become unicorns. Hari is passionate about helping founders build great companies and supporting women leaders discover their potential. Welcome to the panel, Hari. Great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Lloyd. My pleasure.
Next up, Papa CJ needs little introduction. Papa CJ has pulled some time from his vacation in Turkey and has agreed to be on this panel, which is good. He'll bring a fresh new perspective. Papa CJ, as you all know, is a world-renowned stand-up comedian. He's also an executive coach and a published author. He holds an MBA from the University of Oxford. As an executive coach, he's worked with 50-plus blue-chip companies across the globe. He's been invited to speak at Harvard Business School and written for the renowned HBR. Wow, and I thought HBR was only for retired old professors. I think I must get my subscription going. Papa CJ has worked across cultures in over 25 countries. His experience and expertise exist in the intersection of creativity, communication, humor, business, leadership development, and human interaction. Great to have you on this panel, Papa CJ.
Thanks a lot, Lloyd. Lovely to be here.
Next up is Heather Gupta. Heather is based in London. In a career spanning almost 30 years, Heather has worked with some of the world's top companies, including P&G, McCann Erickson, J. Walter Thompson, Dole Lintas, and Byju's. She's an ICF certified coach and a chartered fellow of CIPD, which is the Chartered Institute of Personal Development. Heather moved back to London from India in June 2022 to take on a new role as the Global HR Director for the Zeal Group, ZFX, a fintech company. Her work takes her all over the world, leading HR teams in Europe, Southeast Asia, China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. Heather's dialing in from London. So welcome to the panel, Heather.
Thank you, Lloyd. Wonderful to be here.
Next up is Jagdish Kini, who's based in Bangalore, but presently traveling on work to Hyderabad. Jagdish has been the ex-managing director of Gillette India. He's been executive director at Bharti Airtel. And currently, he's an executive coach. He sums up his career in a line. I feel blessed to have learned to build and manage brands at P&G. I learned to build and manage companies at L'Oreal and Gillette. And I learned to build an industry at Airtel. So that's some experience. Currently, Jagdish is an executive coach and has coached over 250 CEOs and CXOs and has trained over 2,500 executives across countries. Thanks for making the time, Jagdish from Hyderabad, and welcome to the panel.
Thanks, Lloyd. Pleasure to be here.
And last up is Prabir Jha, quite a HR guru. Prabir is a LinkedIn power profile, a TEDx speaker, and a columnist. In fact, yesterday, his column appeared in the Times of India. A human resource strategist with diverse industry experience from the civil services to engineering, IT, pharmaceuticals, and automotive. He's been CHRO of 2 New York Stock Exchange listed companies and 2 Fortune 500 companies. He's helped those companies make it to the list of top 10 best companies to work for in India. Prabir currently advises a range of companies from startups to large corporations across a range of domains on strategic HR issues, including board effectiveness, talent and learning, organizational transformation, culture renewal, executive coaching, and employer branding and talent search. That's terrific experience. Welcome to this panel, Prabir. Great to have you here.
Hi, Lloyd. Thank you. Looking forward.
What we'll do over the next hour is really focus on the issue of moonlighting and really the way forward, as I said. We're also punctuating this with a few audience polls so we can understand where all of us on this webinar, what's everyone thinking. Now, the word moonlighting has a legacy. In an era where companies paid employees for a fixed number of hours in a week or a month, and employees use a part of their time for other gigs, that was quite rightly considered cheating, right? You're being paid for a certain amount of work, and then you were, actually cheating in a manner of speaking. However, in a sense, times have changed, and a lot of the work has become knowledge work, right? Companies no longer pay knowledge workers for a fixed number of hours, right? They expect them to be available for as many hours as was necessary to accomplish business goals. So in a sense, most of us work towards a kind of business output, right? It's not really the hours we log in. We don't punch our card in when we enter the office and punch. And specifically in the last, 2.5 odd years with the pandemic, working from home, working, different hours, working different time zones has become a way of life. We also often use the word FTEs, just full-time employees, which translates roughly as employees who are committed to their employers full-time and vice versa. FTEs also sign exclusive employment contracts with their employers, which preclude them from pursuing other full-time or part-time paid opportunities, and are supposed to devote 100% of their time to their companies. On the other hand, employees, the younger generation especially, and a lot of them who were on board during the pandemic, don't seem to hold the same view, and they value their freedom and flexibility to pursue multiple opportunities that can add up to their experience, their skills, and obviously their bank balance. Right? So there clearly is, seemingly 2 different views. We'll just kick off this debate first by launching the first of our little audience polls, just trying to understand what everyone on this panel, or everyone on this webinar believes about moonlighting. Right? So can we just have the first poll? And for everyone, all you have to do is just click a yes or no to this simple question: is moonlighting unethical? Oh, that's a perfect start. So we roughly got our audience divided right down the middle. 48% believe moonlighting is unethical, and 52% believe it's not. So great starting point. Interesting. Perfect start. So can I sort of kick it off with you, Hari, and understand what are your thoughts on this whole subject of moonlighting? Is it really unethical, or is it pretty okay to go ahead with?
Yeah. So the way I would see it, Lloyd, is that, times are changing. The nature of work itself is changing. It has been changing for a while, but I think the pandemic accelerated this, especially for white collar stuff in India. So I think, there are 2 ways in which you can respond to change. One is, accept it and embrace the change and go along, or you can keep on resisting it, till you're forced to accept it. So I think the smarter thing would be to, really understand what moonlighting really means instead of responding to or reacting to that single word. So, for example, as long as the company is imposing certain reasonable restrictions on what employees can do and cannot do, I think it's fair. And as long as those restrictions are reasonable, for example, not being allowed to do another full-time job, for instance, I think is a reasonable restriction. And, not disclosing confidential information, not working for a direct competitor is all, perfectly all right. But the moment you get into, you're available for us 24/7, and whether you're at office or, you are at home, You need to be available to do our work, need to be thinking always about us. I think that's a very unfair expectation. And I think, as long as restrictions are reasonable, I think people will begin to accept it. And if you see, current contracts, I think, are very asymmetric in many ways. And companies resort to a lot of these motherhood statements, motherhood ideas to prevent competition from taking away their resources. So, for example, you can't work for a competitor. Who is a competitor? For example, for TCS, if Infosys is a competitor, what will a software engineer do? And one software engineer is hardly going to be able to change or impact Infosys in a very negative way by going and working for TCS. So these are all very motherhood statements which are just used to prevent people from joining competition and making life a little difficult for competition. So I think these are some of the issues. And at some point of time, even someone like Narayan Murthy had said, things like, the pay ratio between the CEO and someone very junior can't be more than 25 to 30 times. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with that, but he has said it. But if you look at his own company or the company that he founded, which is Infosys, if the starting salary is 3 lakhs per annum, then the CEO's salary should be probably 80 lakhs, but it's probably 80 crores, closer to 80 crores than 80 lakhs. So, many of these statements, of sounding holier than thou and, taking very stringent actions, on pay cuts when things go tough at junior levels, and being very liberal with senior executives, all of these are now coming to the fore. So reactions of people is not just about moonlighting. It's all about a cumulative set of unfair practices that have all mounted and accumulated over the years. So I think as long as restrictions are very reasonable, they're okay. But I don't think restrictions are reasonable in the current form at all.
Thanks, Hari. I think that's a great perspective. Heather, would you like to weigh in on this, please?
Sure, absolutely. So of course, I think we all appreciate this is a trend which has been going on, accelerated by COVID, which changed everything. People suddenly realized they could not go to the office, so they could do multiple things as well. And of course, the younger folks coming in really resist that being tied down to kind of one role and want that flexibility and fluidity. And interestingly, of course, women have technically been moonlighting for years, right? Because we have multiple responsibilities. We have, not that our husbands are our employers, I hope, but we have responsibilities to our family and our partners or our husbands. We also usually end up having to find work. So we're balancing multiple responsibilities. We're having to kind of be responsible to both of those sets of all of those sets of people. And there's no doubt that it's technically possible, therefore, to do this, proven by women. And I actually looked at some numbers just a little bit. So technically, what is a full-time role? And I think this is where the crux of one of the problems lies, right? If we assume we work 10 hours a day, I know in India that's unrealistic, and I'll talk about that because I've just come back to London, so I have a very different context, right? If we assume we work 10 hours a day for 6 days a week, which in India often is the norm, that's 60 hours a week. We have, and I had to do this maths before because I'm really bad with maths, so I had to plan it all in advance. We have 168 hours, according to my maths, of time in a week. So that means that we effectively get left after our working commitments of 15 hours each day. Now, that's a long time. Let's say we sleep for 7 hours of those 15, because sleeping and eating and everything else, we still have time, right? Now, one of the problems is that, particularly in India, now I worked in India for almost 20 years, and I've just come back, so I have this really fresh perspective of the UK versus India. Nobody actually works those hours. So if we had a scenario where people were actually, they'd come into work like they do in London, we come in at 9 o'clock, and by 6 o'clock, everybody's gone. Now, of course, we work weekends, we open our laptops in the evenings, we log in, we do all of that, but it's very, very rare that I will get any communication, even as an HR head, after 6 p.m. or on Saturdays or on Sundays. That has never happened in 20 years of working in India, okay, for various reasons. So the crux of the problem for me is, are you actually even enabling employees to use that so-called free time? And that free time of theirs can be used in whatever way they want to use it, right? If they want to earn some more money, as long as they inform, and it's kind of psychologically contracted for, and this is another area, right? Communication. Is the employer communicating their policy, and is the employee also in communicating their intention, right? So if that is all clear and that's all done, do they even have the time to do that with the sort of psychological expectation that India, and dare I say it, Indian bosses, and I don't like to stereotype, I've worked all over the world, but it's 20 years of personal experience that there is this sort of, you need to be always on expectation. So even if they wanted to, how do they get around that when companies tend to want them to kind of be always there and always kind of at their service? And those HR contracts, by the way, which state 48 hours a week compliance and statutory and legal, I mean, they're really kind of worthless, right? So first of all, how do you even enable people to use those 15 hours a day productively for themselves? Absolutely. Secondly, do you put the communication in place to make sure that you are safeguarding? Because obviously you don't want people working for competition. You don't want them kind of compromising your position. And when that's all there, then we can talk about moving positively, I think, into a moonlighting situation for the future.
Thanks, Heather. I think great point. I'm glad you brought the issue about the fact that women, in a sense, face, in a sense, a larger burden. And I, in a manner of speaking, have been kind of moonlighting. A lot of them take a few breaks for raising children and such like, and just to sharpen their skills. Sometimes that's the only way they could do it, right? And it's difficult, of course, to call motherhood a full-time job or full-time paying job, but it's no less. In fact, possibly much more. So thanks for bringing that perspective. And also, I think I totally agree with you that companies today, increasingly global companies, but companies in India as well, are encouraging a lot of seniors and managers not to send work mail after office hours. My last employer kind of explicitly put out a note saying, no mails out after Friday, 5 o'clock, and not before Monday morning or any workday morning before 9. And of course, then at 9 o'clock, you wake up with that stream of, pre-sent messages which suddenly bombard your mail, but that's another story. Prabir, coming across to you, what are your thoughts on the whole issue of moonlighting? Do you fundamentally see it as a violation of an employee contract, or how do you see it?
See, your opening question was about ethics, and ethics is a very loaded expression, right? Whose ethics is it? Who defines what's ethical and who defines it's not ethical? The simple answer, and I don't want to repeat some of the points that Hari made and Heather made, and I agree with them. See, to me, moonlighting is fundamentally an issue of honesty of intent and acceptance of the articulation between the two sides. Both. And both sides have a lot to complain for, but both sides have also a lot to blame. No one forced a person to accept the terms of appointment of a certain company. Why did you sign up? Did you read? No, actually, no one reads those 10 pages, which even I never read, right? It's all legacy. But the fact is that a lot of fine print is kind of hidden. And, these contracts do have a certain dimension of legality. So if you've accepted something, you need to comply with it till either side chooses to renegotiate. And then, you decide whether you want to work or not work, whether it is the restrictions are merited, not merited. It's a free world. It's a free talent supply. So if it's not, the person makes the choice. So that's the first comment that I have. The second is, even if you were to kind of be more transparent and honest with the recent experiences, I think you have to see it from more a societal context. Why is it that people are wanting to do things beyond their mainline job? Even either they are not fully engaged or they have spare hours, because if what I heard Heather share, if the hours are as bad as they are, you should be exhausted. You should not have any time to or energy to do anything different. But if they have, is it that the work itself is not consuming them? The kind of work does not thrill them, either from a learning perspective, from a sense of significance, and no one wants to feel left behind in this talent war. So you pick up something which at least sharpens your skills. And the new world also realizes that organizations, at least in the last some years, have played very conveniently. When you need people, you open the sluice gates and you get all the talent in. And suddenly, if the weather were to turn, you bring them bang down. And now that's not fair play. And we saw that through the COVID. We saw that even post-COVID in cycles. So today, if you ask me, and I've shared this in some of my earlier comments on television and in my writings, I think there is a declining level of trust in organizations between managers and their teams, between leaders, and I would go all the way up from the board down, right? I think there's a lot of hypocrisy at play. And I think somewhere I heard Hari also make that point. I think a lot of it is the outcome of very deep fault lines, and maybe we can talk more about it if we have time as we go along. But I think this lack of trust, breakdown in communication, each one needing to ensure that I am well insured for the downtimes when someone may just lay me off. So it can't be, the employer just because of its brute, collective strength to be able to kind of beat the other guys down. It's a very human psychology need of survival and learning that is getting them to moonlight. So these are some of my top of my comments.
Great, Prabir. Thank you so much for it. I think you made some great points, and do agree that typically and traditionally employment contracts have obviously been loaded in favor of the employer. And coming from the old Karta Datta, in India, we've come to accept the fact that you really can't negotiate a contract very hard or it's loaded. And I think that contrasted with the fact that there's a new generation that just finds this all too stifling. I mean, they just want far more freedom, far more flexibility. I've been seeing a few questions in the chat. So thanks, Sujit, Sumit, Animesh, for your questions. We'll answer them by and by as the thing progresses. But just talking about young people and stifling, I think best time to get in Papa CJ. And what are your thoughts, CJ, on the way this debate is panning out? And especially for someone like you who's done a non-traditional role, you've been a stand-up comic, but you also balance the roles of an executive coach. You also do, leadership seminars and motivational talks. So love to hear what do you think about this whole issue.
So off the top, Lloyd, I'd like to say that I'm a professional speaker. So by participating in this panel, I'm technically moonlighting. So if anybody has a problem with that on ethical grounds, now would be a good time to leave. Otherwise, you're endorsing it. No, jokes apart, here's the thing, right? Now, I want to actually liken, because one of the ways this panel was marketed was saying, is moonlighting cheating? So I would like to liken employment to the contract of marriage, right? Now, what is cheating? So to the other panelists, of course, you don't have to answer it. It's a deeply personal question. But what are you okay with your spouse doing or not doing? Some people have a problem if their spouse goes for a film with somebody else or dances with somebody else. Whereas there are other spouses who are in open marriages and have no problem if their spouse sleeps with somebody else. So I think, the answer to that is that it is different in different marriages. And for a successful marriage, whether it is a relationship or employment, you need to speak in advance and define what the boundaries are. What is acceptable to you. And it will be different for different organizations, but I think different for different employees as well. Unfortunately for employers, we no longer live in a world where you can just say it's my way or the highway. Because if you do that, the best guys are the people who have other options, and they will probably opt for the highway, and the weaker people will stay. But the flip side to that, and I think Prabir alluded to that as well, when you think of the word cheating, there is another definition of it, which is to avoid something undesirable by luck or by skill. So for example, so-and-so cheated death. So my question to employers would be this, and if you look at the research by Scientific American, they've done some research on why do people cheat. And they've discovered that there are 8 key reasons: anger, self-esteem, lack of love, low commitment, need for variety, neglect, desire, and personal situation or circumstance. So my question to you as an employer would be to get behind and understand why your employees feel the need to go somewhere else and seek work. Are they not satisfied? Are they not getting enough variety? Are you not paying them enough? Because we no longer live in an age where people work for organizations. People work for themselves. And you as an organization need to fit in with their purpose and their values and align your goals as an organization to their individual dreams. Because if you don't, the best people will leave. If your solution is to throw money at them, there's always going to be another organization that can throw more money at them. So eventually people will stay for the values, for the purpose, and for the culture. So those are some of my headline thoughts, is to view it just as you would a personal relationship and ask yourselves those questions.
Thanks for bringing that very exciting analogy into play, Papa CJ. In the ideal world, I'd love to run a poll on how many people liken employment to marriage. But that said, I'm going to run another poll before I come to Jagdish. And our second poll is really, and I think you raised some of the questions in your opening remarks, CJ, is what's the most important reason employees moonlight? Why is it that they moonlight? So Nikolai, can you just launch the second poll, please? What's the most important reasons employees moonlight? Okay, so as expected, 71%, so a large percentage, believe that people moonlight for additional income. It's clearly a great way to supplement your income. But quite a few people do believe that people also moonlight to pursue one's passion. If you love doing what you want to do, you moonlight. And I know of stories of innumerable founders of what today's large companies who technically didn't moonlight, but spent a lot of their work hours thinking about their next startup and the big idea they had, and did some of the groundwork. Gray area of ethics, but did some of the groundwork, including some legendary founders. All right. So pursuing one's passion. And then the third really reason is owning one's skills. And I think Gen Z certainly believes that it's a good way to have a plan B, or at least own one's skills. So as good a time as any to bring you in, Jagdish. And you've seen it all from telecom at Bharti Airtel, and before that, traditional consumer, Gillette. What are your thoughts on why is it that a lot of people today are pushing for moonlighting, or at least a lot of young people, and a lot of employees are stuck somewhere in the middle? But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Good evening. I think most of the thoughts which I have been covered directly or indirectly by the panelists. However, let me try to, or let me attempt to sort of bring in a different perspective for what has already been said. This is a change which is perhaps evident. Why do I say that? Is recently I had put up a post, a small write-up on this moonlighting stuff in LinkedIn, and I had 120 reshares, and 96% of those guys were not on my. They were not connected to me. So it evidently tells me that this is a concern. This is a topic which is impacting a lot of people in the industry today. And the way I look at it is that if there is change, the more you resist change, the messier it will get at a later stage. So let's embrace change is what I'm trying to say. So if you ask me, I'm neither for the companies, organizations, nor am I in favor of the employees. I'm only saying that this is a situation where we need to really sit down, and honest communication is going to sort it out. Now, what are the aspects that we need to really look at in this kind of a situation? For me, what comes to my mind is there are about 4 or 5 different aspects to it. Legal is one particular issue. 1948 Factories Act says 48 hours a week, not more than 9 hours a day. Though it says only for factory workers and not for people who are working outside the factory, I presume there must have been a good logic to it. I believe that all laws, whenever they are framed, has a logic. There's a big discussion happening. And one of the logics could be that people need to rest. And rest for those 8-9 hours, be with their family, be happy, and come to work in the next day in a state of mind to be productive. Also, there could be another logic to it, is that if one man works in 2-3 different jobs, are we really taking away jobs of some other needy people? So that's another of the aspects that I'd like to bring to the fore. One of the biggest things is, I think what Prabir has already talked about, is it's a contract and you have signed it. Because you have signed a contract, what's your commitment levels? Now, commitment I see is based on 2 things. One is integrity, the other is wisdom. Integrity says or dictates to us that what thou hast committed, thou shalt deliver. And what wisdom tells us is what thou cannot deliver, thou shalt not commit. Now, if you have signed that contract, then maybe the company is right in enforcing it. Now, all these years, maybe it was not specified So I think honest communication of what their expectations are is very, very essential right now. I also see a trust deficit in all this, which is happening. A trust deficit from both sides. I won't say that the leaders don't trust their employees or the employees don't trust their employers. One of the reasons is employees look at an organization as an entity. Can we look at the organization as a human being? That's my boss, that's my leader. Now, if I start looking at the organization as my leader, I begin to understand that this person is like me.
Sure.
And therefore has the same kind of issues that I'm having. And therefore my demands may be becoming more reasonable. So I believe that trust can only be sort of enhanced if there is honest feedback, there's transparency. And we as a group need to be vulnerable, accept vulnerability to build that vulnerability-based trust. There is also a mindset aspect to this. The way I look at it is it's an abundance versus scarcity mindset. The scarcity mindset I'm coming is from the organization. There is a huge amount of churn right now. So they are, organizations have moved from developing talent pools to talent acquisition. The words tell me that earlier, when I joined Procter & Gamble, the only entry level we had was management training. Any other leadership position had to be filled in from within. So the premise was that we were actually building leaders. But today we are going into talent acquisition, which means we are poaching people. If you are poaching people, there is a dearth. When I look at the education system, there are so many engineers coming out every day, every year. So why do we say there is no talent? I mean, there is talent. Maybe we need to invest a little more in some people and to make them ready for leadership roles. And when I look at the scarcity mindset from the employee side of you, perhaps even the poll suggested that it's the money. Why do I need to make that much more money? Am I being underpaid? And from an integrity point of view, there's a question which is, am I taking away somebody else's job? And if I am I contributing to the unemployment in the organization and in the country? So
but to be fair, Jagdish, I think a lot of people getting into the workforce are not going to take that macro look, right? For a person, it's always about making some more. And, greed is limitless, right? I'm sure like some of our richest billionaires still think about how do they make their next billion. But I think the point I'm taking from what you're saying, which I think is really true, is that the old employee mindset of having a career plan, right? When some of us who started our careers, let's say in the 80s and 90s, we look forward to a 15, 20, maybe a lifetime in a company. And where they actually grew you, they rotated you between departments, they rotated you between countries to really grow you to leadership. I think that's weakening, right? A lot of Fortune 500 companies possibly have a vision that lasts 3 quarters or maybe a couple of years. So I think in that context, a lot of the workspace is becoming transactional, right? Not just startups. I know large corporations that can't guarantee anybody a role out, 3 months after his last appraisal where he got an A+, suddenly finds himself being slipped. So I think there is an issue and certainly want to come to that. But I just want to quickly react to some great audience questions in. I think, CJ, you want to say something? Please come in.
I just want to jump in on one thing. One thing that really stood out where we had the poll say 72% of people moonlight for additional income. There is one thing that I really have a problem with in the recruitment process. This is where potential employers or new employers ask their potential employees in the interview process what their previous salary was, right? Now, you are not valuing these new employees based on what they can contribute to your organization. You're finding out, okay, this is what the guy or girl got in their last job. Let me add 5% and give them an offer. So maybe they're already coming in with not earning enough in that job, not earning what they potentially feel their value is for 100% of their time. So I think that's a practice organizations should stop in terms of, benchmarking from a previous salary, as opposed to putting a value on what they can deliver for your organization. again, I speak from the point of view of somebody who hasn't been in a real job for the last 20 years. So I'm sure the experienced HR folks from organizations will have a different perspective.
No, but that's great. That's a great perspective, and thanks for sharing that. I've seen a big stream of interesting questions coming, and we're going to get there shortly. But just to put you on the spot, Hari, and I think Rahul Bambi raised this interesting point, which is if you were in Mr. Premji's shoes, in the context of his tweet when he really said that it's fundamentally cheating, and the firing of these 300, how would you have handled the situation?
Yeah, I think let me just step back a little before coming to your specific question. So I think, CJ made a very interesting analogy about, a relationship with an employer being the same as the spouse, the relationship with the spouse. I think it's a wonderful one, but I think where it breaks down is that, most marriages are between two individuals and two equals. But an employment contract is between an individual and a large entity, much larger organization. So the asymmetry of power is very significant. And I don't subscribe to the view at all that, just because you signed up for some contract, you can, companies can hide behind these legal contracts and one-sided contracts, to enforce things. That's a very lawyerish way of looking at it. I don't think companies with, strategic foresight and, a people orientation should be thinking about such legal perspectives. In fact, the more you resort to such legal perspectives, the more one realizes that, you're not able to understand what the real issue is. You can't just simply say you signed up for a one-sided contract, like it or not, stick to it. Then people will, exercise this constitutional right to form unions. So, and you don't want unions to form either. And the reason why people have not formed unions so far is because they've been treated fairly. The moment you stop treating them fairly and hide behind these legalese, that's when people begin to form, unions. So I think, a lot of these clauses are very unfair. And if I were Premji, I think I would have, looked at what are some of the reasonable restrictions that can be imposed. So for instance, doing two full-time jobs is a complete no-no. And I don't think people are doing two full-time jobs, as Heather mentioned, as everybody else understands also. It's actually impossible to do two full-time jobs, 8-9 hours into two is about 16-18 hours. It's actually impossible to do that. So I think what these guys are mostly worried about is that they are earning something on the side and, they're not fully available to us. Their mind, body, soul is not fully available to us. So I think that's the problem. That's a very serious problem. And you know what? They don't want, Infosys would not want somebody to go and join TCS because TCS might offer a higher salary and vice versa. So they make life difficult for competitors to recruit. And therefore, they're killing a free labor market. And that again is completely wrong. You just cannot kill a free labor market by resorting to these motherhood ideas that you can't work for a competitor. I can understand if you are a vice president in a company, part of an executive team, doesn't make sense to work for a company, you can impose that restriction, but not for a software engineer, senior software engineer, tech lead. That guy is not going to make any difference by working for a competitor. So this is completely unreasonable. If I were Premji, I would look at all these unreasonable restrictions and take them off. Having a 60 to 90-day notice period for software engineers is completely unreasonable, designed to kill a free labor market, designed for competition not to be able to recruit you, designed to ensure you don't have any other place to go. So I think these are clauses that just need to go away. So I think if I were Premji, instead of calling it cheating, I would have called out what is moonlighting. I would never have used a coded, loaded word like moonlighting and have said, doing two full-time jobs is probably unfair. It violates a contract. I would have said, for example, working for a competitor is unfair. But using a coded word like moonlighting and calling it cheating is actually, distorting the argument and raising emotions which are completely unnecessary. So I would never have done what Premji has done. I think I would just look at contracts. I would look at what are unfair things, take them off, have an open discussion, try to figure out why people are, doing this. And I think, people perform better if they're allowed to fulfill their passions on the side. It's very important. And I think, if I were Premji again, I would classify everything into three categories. First category, these are things you just cannot do. Yeah. Category 2 is, you can do, but just speak to us before you do them. Third category, for example, is you don't even need to talk to us. Because, for example, if you're binge watching, history TV serials at night on weekends, that it makes you less productive on Monday, a company cannot impose that restriction that you can't be binge watching TV serials. and they can't be telling you that you can't work 4 hours on weekends because it makes you less productive. So I think I would just take off these unfair restrictions completely.
Thanks for being so forthright and candid. I think that's a great point. And like I said, if at all you're doing something else on the side, at some level it should anyway come through in your appraisals, in the quality of your performance, that should even out. But on that subject, interesting that something like Gurnani, CEO of TechMahindra, recently said that they actually welcome some degree of employees doing gigs or even moonlighting on the side. And of course, gig economy companies like Swiggy have been on it for a while. I'm just going to launch our third poll, which is really at the core of this issue, which is, should companies officially permit and encourage moonlighting? The likes of, say, Swiggy and TechMahindra and what their CEOs have said. So would like everyone just to take a few seconds and just quickly answer this poll.
While the poll is being answered, I just wanted to jump in on something that Hari had said about the asymmetry of power. I think one of the problems that currently exists with organizations is that they still believe that there is an asymmetry of power. They don't realize that it's different for employees now, especially for the younger generation, where they don't believe that there is an asymmetry of power. And
good point. Great point, CJ. In fact, it also speaks a bit to what I think Jagdish was alluding to when he talked about saying that employment contracts, in a sense, is about the validity. But the reality, Jagdish, is that right now, a lot of employers don't look at employees as part of the family, as they once proclaimed in the 80s and 90s. Now it's like, I need a specific role. They won't publicly say for a specific time, but very often it is about hire and fire or take someone on till as good as the role is valid. And then, one bad quarter and a few tough questions from the street, and they won't think twice about drawing the pink flag. But before we come back to responses on this, can we have the poll results, Nikolai? Should companies officially permit moonlighting? And it says only under clear guidelines, so 73%. A small percentage, 18% said yes, and there's an 8% unequivocal no. So Prabir, just coming to you, and the fact that, some enlightened businesses, if I may call them so, have kind of openly welcomed or accepted the reality that in this new world, it's difficult to restrict what employees do outside of their work hours. And the fact that everyone has a passion to pursue and needs more income and so on and so forth. So how do you see this evolving? What do you think new age employers of startups or even large corporations need to alter within their current HR plans and employee contracts?
So, Lloyd, one is we need to first acknowledge the changing societal mores. And I tend to agree with CJ that, it is a free agent reality. It's only the downturns which makes the employers have the upper edge. Otherwise, it's talent which typically rules the roost. And they have been equally short-lived with their own associations with companies. So there is no perfect answer. It cuts both ways. But the reality is India particularly is changing, and a lot of conversation is still more tech industry biased. And that's what the media overplays, as if that's the only employer in India, which is actually not true. Actually, it's a much smaller percentage of the huge organized and semi-organized workforce that India actually has. And there are two very distinct parallel social thoughts that I see. And I'm wearing a little bit of my old civil service hat here. One is there is a breed, and I personally don't like stereotyping. I don't like to believe every millennial or Gen Z thinks exactly the same, because they come from their own social reality, their own economic reality, their own demographic context. So it's a little, the media has oversimplified and overpainted it. I don't like it. So there are many caveats to the comment. But one is there is a breed of talent which still believes in job security. It wants more assurances. And maybe such kind of people would go to my first job, work for the President of India, nothing wrong with it, right? Then they shouldn't be bothered about all this. There's the other bit which wants space, independence, experimentation. What is unsaid for many of them is they still want the assurances of social security, health cover, so-called careers. Now you can't have the cake and eat it too. So the reality is we are living with a duality here. And organizations will first need to acknowledge that you have to select horses for courses. When you ask me the question, what should more progressive companies think for, and which I believe in my now advisory perspective from the sidelines, I think a lot of their organizational thinking is time warped. Starting all the way from the board, the composition of board, the way the thinking of the board is, the management team, everyone talks from the pulpit that they want to innovate and experiment. I will be very brutal. I don't think that's what they practice. And this is very, very disappointing for me. It's not politically right, but I think that's where the problem starts. Your staffing model needs a dramatic change. What's the point of hiring so many people when you can't offer careers to more than 10% of them, meaningful careers? You will run attrition. So why don't you decide what could be better done with gig? So people who want to explore multiple opportunities, which I talked once on a television show as corporate polygamy or corporate polyandry, they will explore those, and it's fine. The expectations are clear. Set your offer very clearly, set their constraints clearly, and so be it. And there will be some people who will want to kind of build dedicated careers with individuals. And I think unless there is honesty of intent and the willingness to experiment, this unwillingness of organizations not to atomize their HR thinking to what is actually needed is the biggest mindset problem that I see all the way from boards and the C-suite down. That needs
great point. Great point. In fact, one of our listeners kind of has sent a lovely point saying that, what about companies that report other income? Or what about independent directors that sit on multiple boards? Not competing, of course, but sit on multiple boards. So clearly there are issues there that need to be resolved. But coming to you, Heather, and bring in a little bit of the international context, how are companies across the world looking at this, this generation of workers, gig workers, so to speak, who want to have their cake and eat it too? They want the security of full job, but they also want to do fun things. They want to make money on the side. And where do you see regulation evolving in this space, and how do you think we move forward from here?
Well, I have only a London perspective right now, and that is only 4 months old. Because
but
although
you can wear your whole white hat perspective from India and the fact that you guys hired from all over. Sure.
That's a very, very good point. Yeah, and in fact, my last role, I was working in a global role. So I think this cynicism and the desire to kind of control employees, and also to Papa CJ's point about what your worth is defined by the previous role you have, which I also think is terribly wrong and doesn't happen here in the UK. I think these are all things which are fairly deeply inbuilt into many organizations. And I think what is lacking across the world, even in the organization I sit in today, which is in London, as I said, we have this very nice 9 to 6, and we have the weekends and everything else. There is still a feeling at the top level that, we've gone to hybrid working because of COVID and post-COVID, and everyone's doing it, but we kind of want to get people back 5 days a week. And that's not necessary or required. And I think it's about educating people through that paradigm. So I think it exists everywhere. And I think the way to look at it is to start thinking about, how do we build this trust? I mean, we've heard a lot of people talk about trust, right? In a marriage, to go back to that analogy, we hopefully trust our partners. They go out and they do whatever. They come back at the end of the day. We don't ask them, where were you? What did you do? Who did you see? Who were you with? Because we have that sort of trust, right? And of course, there are boundaries that we kind of set in place. I think with most employers, there is still a belief that they hold the majority of the so-called power, and that the employee is just somebody they can sort of hire and fire at will. All over the world, not just in India. Although in India, it's more overtly expressed. What I've also found is that India is just very honest about what it thinks, right? They will ask you how old you are. They will ask you all these questions, which you're not allowed to ask legally in the UK. But people do find ways to find the answers to those questions. So it's not like the rest of the world is perfect and India is not. It's just that India is more direct in asking those questions, right? So I think it's about really building that trust. It's also about understanding, we've heard it many times, that actually the power lies with the employee, because we're in the middle of the Great Resignation, which has been going on for a while post-COVID. Every single talent acquisition, as we call it, but I know that's a very acquisitive word, but every single recruiter is desperately looking for people, particularly in tech. Honestly, the employee has all the cards in their hands. And just to come to somebody's point, somebody asked a question, then why can't we inform the manager we have other work? Because we're scared. Why are we scared? Because our growth will be limited or throttled.
Sure.
And that's again about trust, right? And it's about having the ability to say to people, look, we don't own your lives, right? We expect you to come in, we expect you to work productively, we'll set you goals, we'll measure your goals, we'll do all of that good HR stuff. And that's what we contract you to do for X amount of money, which should be for the role and isn't. And until that trust is there, and employers say, what you do in your spare time, as long as it doesn't compete, which is where the contracting is really, really important, we go with our blessing, and we really believe that it'll make you an even better performer in your work.
Absolutely.
So it all comes back to that trust.
Sure. I guess the trust is a very important part. Yes, CJ, you want to come in with a small point here?
Just a quick one, Lloyd. I think there is something that every organization does now for customers, but they don't do for employees. So there's a term which is quite popular, which is hyper-localization. We want to treat each customer as an individual customer, yet you decide to treat employees as a commodity. Whereas I think our employment contracts need to be hyper-localized. You need to treat each employee as an individual as well. And the other point was something that Prabir brought up in terms of the composition of the board. Today, technically on this panel as well, I'm supposedly representing the youth. I'm 45 years old, right? The people we're talking about are maybe 25 or 30. I'm 20 years removed from them. Why is one of them not on this panel? And when boards think about employees in recruitments, they should be bringing that 25-year-old into that conversation to be able to actually get the point of view of somebody in that situation.
Absolutely, CJ. Totally agree with you. In fact, just the perfect time to launch our fourth and last little poll, which is really about what should happen in terms of making Moonlight more acceptable. So, Nicola, if you can launch the last poll, which is what can help, or what regulations or infra can help moonlighting, right? Is it explicit employee contracts on do's and don'ts? Is it clearly laid out policies by companies? Is it a quality marketplace for gig workers and employers, right? Where everyone can put it up there? Or is it good old-fashioned government regulation, right? So what are the thoughts? What's everyone's thoughts here? And while we're on that, just to bring in a little point, one was reading a little bit about what is government regulations today. So as it happens today, the legislation in India does not entirely prohibit or ban moonlighting. There are a number of laws, the Factories Act of 1948 that forbids double employment for adult workers, but that covers only factory workers in what is called Section 60, right? So there is no real provision against that. So I think that's one part. And the second is really about, even recently, the Minister of State for Commerce and IT, Rajiv Chandrasekhar, who's been a kind of private sector man, so to speak, for a good part of his life, he backs moonlighting. He said days are long gone when employees signed up with big tech majors and spend their lives on the job, right? He also added saying that services sector must adjust to the new reality, given the lure of startups and high attrition rates. So I think there is a belief that organizations have to move from a slightly more rigid perspective. And strange that, India's kind of calling card in the 90s, IT is the one at the center of the storm. But before we get the way forward and answer a couple of questions, just want to see the response to this last poll, Nikolai. That's a fairly split house. What regulation can help moonlighting? So one is 21% believe explicit employee contracts on do's and don'ts. 40% saying clearly laid out policies by companies. 30% believe quality marketplaces, right? So these are gig economy marketplaces for gig workers and employers. And obviously, fewest people want government sanctioned rules. So quickly, Jagdish, if you can weigh in, what do you think is the one big need that kind of can meet both employers' needs as well as young employees, right? Employers want asset-light models. They want the ability to hire and fire basis need. They also want specific skill sets. And young people, in a sense, want the same. So what can enable it? And ideally, if you can restrict it to about a minute.
All through this discussion, I think every one of us is talking about seeking clarity. And I think that's really what is required. And again, one size does not fit all. So each company may have to want to exploit what they really want. So I have a very simple suggestion. The leadership, you pick up 10 people in the leadership and you pick up maybe 100 people in the employees who are lower down in the hierarchy. You make 2 of these boards and you ask both these boards to brainstorm and come up with just 2 pages. One page is saying, the leadership says what the company expects out of their employees. And on the other page, they have to say what they think the employees expect from the organization. Similarly, the employees get together, brainstorm, and write 2 pages. One is what they expect from the organization, and second page is what they think the organization expects from them. Then let them exchange their pages, compare the pages, and have an honest discussion on that. I'm sure things will work out. I'm sure they'll find ways and means of going forward, because ultimately it has to be a win-win for both.
Great, Jagdish. Quick thoughts on this, Hari. Do you want to quickly, see what are the things you'd like to see happening to make this thing work for both?
Yeah. So I think, clearly this has to be very, very company specific, because you can't have one size fits all. So Swiggy's stand is very different from Wipro's, is very different from some other companies. So for example, Swiggy has taken an open position that, moonlighting is perfectly all right. I mean, as long as you don't work for competition or write code for Zomato. Whereas, the services companies, IT services companies have taken the approach of consulting lawyers to figure out what are the boundaries within which their employees can operate. Such a negative thinking. So I think each company needs to figure out what are humane ways in which they can get their people to work, what are the best ways to retain talent in a new world, and need to begin to embrace change. So I think some people will embrace change quickly. Some companies will, hang on to the past, hoping that they can consult lawyers to figure out how they can constrain their employees. So I think each company will have to find their own answers, and the marketplace for talent will ensure that sooner or later, everyone will figure out what works.
Perfect. A quick question to Prabir, and this comes from Sumit Roy, who said, shouldn't we just accept the gig economy and not have employees? Hire and retain good gig talent. That way, the employer will always be on their toes. You'll also have lower overheads, no salaried employees, no layoffs, and perfect skill match. Prabir?
So Lloyd, that's the point I made a little earlier, that companies will have to creatively reimagine their staffing model. And I personally think there's a huge opportunity. And just stealing the thought further from what Hari mentioned, is this issue a little more exaggerated than what it merits? I think sometimes I feel, are we making a mountain of a molehill? Directionally, there are signs of change. There is no doubt about it. But 300 people out of 300,000 people, is it just the tip of the iceberg, or is that an overly exaggerated story because the media has splashed it? I believe that if organizations were to be honest, could they ask their 300,000 employees or 200,000 employees or whatever number of employees, guys, would you want your terms of contract to be different? Now, if people are scared and say that, no, I'm fine with it, you've got your answer. You cannot say, well, I felt somehow different, but I wasn't sure. But if people did, it gives you a lot of honest data. And I personally would feel that we should be comfortable renegotiating, and renegotiating does not mean we will shake hands. If either we don't feel comfortable or the talent does not feel comfortable, we'll part ways. So be it. I mean, there is a risk on both sides, but there is a gain for both sides. But my thesis is it needs a very, very different cultural thought process, a lot of authentic leadership intent, because times are changing and you just cannot beat talent down today. Talent will find its own level. And I have very strongly talked about it in the past, that, like you attract a certain breed of people to your organization, in today's world, whether you like it or not, you will attract the talent that you will keep. And that's the choice you've got to make. And if you think you're losing the talent war because you're being very dogmatic about it, I think you are not a prudent enough organization.
Perfect.
That will be my
Great. Being totally conscious of time, this class is short of almost running. We're out of time. But Papa CJ, just some closing words of wisdom as being the only young person on the panel.
Well, relatively speaking, I think for me, it eventually comes down to empathy. You have to humanize how you deal with employees because they are human beings. I think it was Hari or Prabir who mentioned you have to have company-specific policies. I would go further and say it needs to be individual-specific, because you could argue that leadership is the management of energy. And if you can't tap into or channelize the energy of every individual in your organization, you need to be able to give them an outlet where they can express that energy. And until you figure out a way to deal with this, you can just hire professional comedians who can help you laugh about it.
Okay, so the bottom line is the question of moonlighting doesn't need to be answered with a hard yes or no. Aspirations have risen and people are no longer satisfied with a regular job and just regular incomes. They want more, right? And therefore, what we cannot change, we must embrace and manage. The challenge is to really make moonlighting work for everyone, right? For employees, for the young people. Great panel, great discussions. Thank you so much, Prabir, Hari, CJ, Heather, and Jagdish. Really appreciate your time. Thanks, Team Moonlight, for putting this together. You've been a great platform on the gig economy for a while now, right now. And I'm sure this whole debate will kind of help your business cause to a large extent. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for the audience. Some great questions. Hopefully, some of them will be able to mail, or you can reach out to most of our panelists who are very active on LinkedIn. But thanks, everyone, for your time on a working day. I hope this didn't count as moonlighting. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
So much. Bye-bye.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.